So while we try and continue to make tests, I will tell you who is going to be in this next panel. Our next panel is called Happiness, Quality of Life, and Subjective Well-Being, New Considerations for Development. Basically, this is going to be a conceptual discussion about these topics. What is happiness? What is quality of life? What's well-being? Are there differences between these terms? What are they useful? How can they be used? Are there frivolous topics or not? It is important to have such a discussion as a way to start and open all this subject. The objective of this panel is to understand the existing differences between these concepts and the capabilities to measure quality of development. Are you ready? So we have, in this panel, we have Janot, who is a Dutch psychologist and researcher, a research investigator at Rotterdam University, and we have Daniel Hayrom, a North American psychologist and researcher at St. Louis, Missouri, Gordon Matthews, a North American anthropologist, researcher, and professor of Hong Kong University, Wenceslao, and Chilean researcher who is the director of Wellbeing Institute in Chile. And sorry, I didn't mention Robert Biswas Diener. So with no further introduction, I'm going to yield the floor now to this first key lecture to Jan Ott. Jan Ott studied sociology and law at the Erasmus Rotterdam University. He specialized himself in public policies, constitutional law. He worked for employment. In 2004, he participated as a government representative at different conferences from the World Organization, Labor Organization. Sorry, he has worked at the Erasmus University in the social studies school, and he is currently a faculty member at that same school. So, with no further introduction, we yield the floor to Mr. Jan Ott.
Some years ago, or let me be more precise, many years ago, I was a student at the same university, and then I studied sociology, constitutional law, government administration, and so on. Now, after those studies, I went to the Dutch Ministry of Social Affairs and Employment to work there as a policy advisor. And well, it was a very interesting job. I had to deal with trade unions and with the employers. And I cannot resist the temptation to say that those consultations, tripartite or bipartite, between governments, trade unions and employers can be really a source of trust and institutional quality. But I'm afraid we would need another conference to discuss that subject. So now I went back to the university. I joined the Happiness Research Group of Ruud Veenhoven. Some of you know him probably. It's a pity he couldn't be here because of family reasons, but I'm sure you will see him again. At the university we work very much together with economists. We are part of the Erasmus School of Economics, and we have many interesting discussions about things like expected and experience utility, about stated and revealed preferences, and about external effects. So that's all very interesting and also relevant for happiness research. We also, let me see if this works. Yes, it does. We also maintain the World Database of Happiness, a beautiful name. And there we collect a lot of information about happiness research, and we try to make that as accessible as possible for anyone who is interested. So you see a link, but you can also Google, you'll find it easily. Now I want to spend attention to the following issues. First of all, the concept of happiness, and I'll present a definition, the usual one, I must say. Then I'll say a few words about the nature of happiness, happiness as a real phenomenon. Then I'll pay attention to the stability of happiness. Even at an individual level, happiness is rather stable, and that's quite a surprise if you look at the background. And then I will present you some distributions of happiness in nations. And if I have enough time, then I will also pay attention to the importance of good governance, of good public governance for happiness. So first of all, about happiness or life satisfaction. Those two are equivalent. In order to understand what it is very useful to make distinctions between 4 kinds of satisfaction. Satisfaction is the more general name. That is subjective well-being, well-being as experienced. And you can discern 4 types. You can make a distinction between passing and enduring satisfaction, passing short-term, temporal, and enduring more permanent. That's one distinction. And you can make a distinction between satisfaction about life as a whole and satisfaction about something that is more limited than that. Now, if you combine those 2 distinctions, you get eventually 4 types. First of all, you see pleasure and domain satisfaction. Now, pleasure, that is short-term, passing, and it is related to something small, like having a nice cup of tea or reading a good book or a nice conversation or whatever. That is short and it is related to something specific. Then domain satisfaction, that is more enduring, but it's also related to something more specific, some aspect of your life, like your income or your job or your house or whatever. Now then, if you go to satisfaction that are related to your life as a whole, or even more than that, then we can discern peak experiences, very short, very nice experiences, and that's really about everything, about your life as a whole, but maybe even the universe as such. And then finally, we have life satisfaction or happiness, and that's what we are talking about today. Now then the definition follows from there. The appreciation of one's own life as a whole. Now that is rather simple, rather easy. The problem with happiness is, however, that in reality it's based on 2 components. It is based on mood and emotions, and it is based on rational evaluation. And that makes happiness a very complicated subject. We can visualize that in a very simple picture. You see that here. On top, overall happiness, that's what we are talking about, but based on 2 components. There are different names for it, but here you see hedonic level of affect is a popular name. You can also say the balance of pleasant and unpleasant affect, or the balance of pleasant and unpleasant emotions. Pleasures and pains in the terminology of Jeremy Bentham. And then at the right-hand side, you see contentment. That is the rational evaluation, more cognitive happiness. And that has to do also with the perceived realization of wants. Now, this picture is really too simple. And Ruud Veenhoven once made a more sophisticated picture or model. And that's what you see here. The top is the same, overall happiness and the two components. But here you see more information about the interaction between the components. Now you don't have to, it is rather complex, but we just have to observe a few things here. First of all, this model is based on the assumption, and that's probably generally accepted now, that your moods and your emotions are the dominant, crucial dynamic for happiness. You see the big yellow arrows. And that goes all the way from human nature to need gratification and so on. So it's really about need gratification that makes people happy. But we can also observe that our brains, our cognition, also plays an important role. Because with our brains, with our cognition, we make standards. And if we have standards, then we use those standards to assess the world and to assess our own position. And in that respect, we may say that it is perhaps a little bit too limited, that contentment is only about the perception of our own needs, the realization of our own needs. It's in general more than that. It's more or less about the gap we perceive between the world as we would like to see it and as it actually is. The gap between is and ought. And I think that's important to remember, because that makes happiness a truly human concept. If you look at the cognitive side, you see it is about the gap people perceive between the world as it is and the world they would like to see. Now, and how do we handle this gap? That's always a crucial question. Because this perception of the gap can lead to constructive challenges. We can say, well, it's not what I would like to see, but you can translate it into something that is really a good challenge, that fits your capabilities. But it's also possible that it is so difficult that people get frustrated and perhaps even aggressive. So that's a crucial point. So the perception of this gap is in a way very personal. It has to do with your own personal situation, but it can also be political. People can share a certain perception of the gap between is and ought. And this morning we have perhaps seen a demonstration of that with this demonstration. Now then, the stability of human happiness, how does it work? Well, here again, it's a matter of interaction between cognition and affect. And a few observations are important. One thing we know from research, that people think a lot about their appreciation of life, or perhaps it's better to say that they think about their appreciation frequently, not every day, not a few days a week, but now and then all of us think about our position and about our appreciation of the situation. That's one point. We also know from research that people have a very high awareness of their moods and their emotions. And we can step back with our brains and say, well, this is my situation, here are my emotions, here are my moods, and how do I assess that? And then the third point, people also try to be consistent. They make models of the world and they try to avoid disconcordancy. And this is a well-known phenomenon because people try to summarize, to make a synthesis of what they see, what they experience, and they try to make a nice picture. And sometimes they go a little bit too far there, and then they neglect important information. And then you see what you can call a cognitive bias. That is also something Kahneman has studied in his discussion of human rationality, or irrationality, I should say. So because of this interaction, you get stability. Now then, about the measurement of happiness, I don't want to talk too long about that, but there are many ways to do it. In our database we have about more than 900 variants of measures, and a measure is usually just a simple question. Sometimes it's a set of questions. So there are many possibilities, and it has to do with the fact that the questions can differ at several points. First of all, they can be different in their focus. Are they focused on overall happiness, or are they more directed at contentment, or more directed on affect? And of course, they can differ in more ways in terms of scales and so on and so on. Now, in the database, you can also find links to empirical research. If a measure is used, very often we can also show what the results are if they are applied. And here you see a few examples. The first one is already mentioned. This is really directed at overall happiness because people are not invited to put priority on cognition or on affect. This is more general. Now, 2 questions there. One question already mentioned by Halliwell. This is obviously very much directed at our cognition. People are really invited here to reflect first before they give an answer, and to think first. And then indeed you can get better correlations with actual living conditions. And then there are several ways to ask questions, and are more directed at the mood and emotions. One is the affect balance scale. Then you ask people to make an inventory of specific positive and negative emotions, and then you can make a balance. Then a day reconstruction method. And then you ask people to reconstruct the previous day, the activities they did the previous day, and to report their emotions. And finally, you have experience sampling, very nice, but expensive, because you need a lot of observations to get a representative picture. And you ask people, how do you feel now? And then they have to answer immediately without any reflection. And that's nice, but then you have to ask it several times to get a good picture. Now, then I'll show you some happiness distributions in nations, and pay attention to the substantial differences you will see between average and inequality. Starting with Denmark. Now, measuring happiness is not so difficult, but of course if you have to take samples, then it gets more complicated. But that's a technical matter. Well, you see that Denmark is indeed a very happy country, many 8s, 9s, and even 10s. It's very exceptional. But one warning must be made here, of course, with all those distributions, and that follows from the distribution. If people say they are happy, they can still have very serious problems, because it is an overall appreciation about life as a whole, and they can be happy in many respects, and then on the balance they are happy, but they can still have very serious problems with their health or whatever. And maybe you know examples in your own environment. So happiness is a very good indicator for the quality of life, but it's not a comprehensive one. And we have seen many good examples of other alternative, additional indicators you can use. So be critical. This is the Netherlands, also very good. Just a small minority of people are really unhappy, and the majority is quite happy. Unfortunately, Denmark and the Netherlands are certainly not representative for the world as such. Here you see a more representative distribution. This is South Africa, and the average is not so bad, but there is a high level of inequality, and of course that has also to do with the political history of this country. And here you see Zimbabwe. That speaks for itself, I'm afraid. Not a nice place to be. This is Morocco. Funny distribution, almost a normal distribution, but not a happy one, because the average is 5, and that's not so good. And finally, Mexico. Yeah, quite good, I would say. But as you know, people in the Latin American countries are always a bit happier than you would expect. And maybe here you should wonder, what about the middle, those scores of 6, 7, and 8? What do people really mean by that? What's their interpretation? And that's already observed by Amartya Sen. He said, yeah, in some cases, people live in very miserable conditions, but they still report quite acceptable levels of happiness. Now, and of course, that they report acceptable levels of happiness is no excuse to lean back and to accept the miserable conditions they live in. So keep that in mind. Now, then I would like to say a few things about the background, the reasons for the substantial differences between nations. And then the quality of the government is a very important factor. And the problem is that there is no general concept for the quality of government. Not in general, but we have a lot of data. We have a lot of data, in particular, from the World Bank. And well, some of you are familiar. The World Bank has 6 indicators for certain aspects of the quality, and that's voice and accountability, political stability, and then government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, and control of corruption. 6 indicators. Now, the World Bank makes assessments for the 6 indicators, and of course they have a clear concept for the 6 indicators, but they don't aggregate anything. They leave it as it is. But I think, and it has done before, that it is useful to make a distinction between 2 dimensions. You can make an aggregation of the first 2, voice and accountability and political stability, and then you can talk about the democratic quality of the governments. And you can aggregate the last 4. Government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, and control of corruption. It makes sense to do this because the democratic quality, that is a very sensitive subject, because that's about the power distribution in a nation. And if you want to change that, well, that's tricky. You can see that in many countries. It's easier to do something about the technical quality of a government, because that's less controversial. And there is another reason to make this distinction, a statistical reason. You see very high correlations, we have heard what it is, between the 4 indicators of the technical quality. 0.91 to 0.98, that's extremely high. So it's really one factor that you are measuring there. With democratic quality, it's more problematic. The correlations are much lower. Now here you see the correlations between happiness and those different aspects of the quality of government. And you see that technical quality is really an important factor, a very high correlation. And that's also true for the 4 components of the technical quality. The correlation for democratic quality is much lower, also for the 2 components. And finally, I did a little check with failed state index, and you get a similar result. Minus, because high score mean a low quality. Now, I want to skip this now because I have to hurry. Oh. Yeah, I want to say a few words about the mechanism. Why is a good governance so important for people? How does it work? How is the process? And first of all, I would like to point out that it is very important in direct contacts between citizens and government officials, people from the police or from the local government. And people talk a lot about that, about their experiences, bad or positive, with those government agencies. So that is important, and that is very evident, very trivial in a way. People want to be treated carefully and with respect. And this is often ignored in happiness studies. And what's in the background, that is the applications of the basic principles of good governance. And they are everywhere in all countries, in different pieces of legislation, common law, whatever. In the Netherlands, yes, okay, 2 minutes. In the Netherlands, we have those rules, but just as an example, no competence without legal basis, decisions after careful preparation and consistent with the purpose of legislation, so no abuse of power. Decision must be motivated and understandable. People may have objections, and they must have the possibility to appeal to higher levels or to an independent court. So the separation of powers is important. And the last one is also very important and difficult sometimes in many poor nations. Equal situations must be treated equally. So no reciprocity. I do something for you, you do something for me. That is no good governance. So no client systems and no patronage. So that is in direct context. And of course, we all know also the government can play an important role by creating conditions that are good for happiness, that are conducive to happiness. And in general, by creating security, stability, and predictability, so that people can make their own life plans, can make their own key decisions in life, as mentioned by Halliwell, and can invest in their future, not just financially, but also emotionally. So that's important. And security, of course, remember Maslow. If people, especially children, are exposed to high levels of insecurity, and this can have a very negative impact on their personal development and on their happiness. So that's in general, a general condition, security, predictability. Then, of course, governments can create specific conditions that are good for happiness, like economic growth, healthcare, infrastructure, education, and gender equality. Gender equality is also important, not just for women, by the way, but also for men. And now I really have to stop, otherwise they will kick me out. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Ahn. He is very tall, and that makes him very happy because of his height. In any case, we will continue with the renowned researcher of positive psychology, Robert Bisbes-Dinner. He's a researcher and a practitioner of this science, and he's part of the editorial board of the Journal of Happiness Studies and Journal of Positive Psychology. He's author of Courage Quotient in the year 2012, and practicing positive psychology coaching, and he co-authored this with his father, Ed Dinner. I would like to make an announcement before we give the word to Professor Robert Biswit. There's a Twitter page, and we will try to find a way to hand these questions to the speakers later on, so that we can have interactive participation. So, Dr. Robert Biswit-Dinner, thank you.
Primero tengo que decir que prefiero hablar contigo hoy en español, pero qué lástima, no es posible. Porque cuando asistí mi clase de español en mi escuela secundaria, en mi primer año y mi año segunda, recibí un grado de F. Entonces voy a continuar en inglés con permiso. I'm sorry I wasn't a better student. I would like to start with an activity, if we could. I would like to ask you this question. How happy are you right now? And I want you to reflect on the answer. How happy are you right now? And probably you can come up with some type of determination of your current state of happiness. And I would like to then ask you an alternative question. How happy are you in general? In general, in your life, how happy are you? And I want you to reflect on that question. If you're like most people, the answer between these two questions is slightly different. Notably, you are able to come up with a determination of your own happiness in both instances. But in the first case, when I ask you about your momentary happiness, your happiness right this second, there's a tendency to pay attention to a certain set of factors, a tendency to pay attention to physiological cues and signals, maybe how comfortable your chair is, your amount of hunger, if you slept well, if you're bored, if you're interested, your current physiological and emotional feeling. And in the second case, when I ask you about your life in general, you are likely to consider an entirely separate set of circumstances. In this case, you're far more likely to consider your income, your job, your family, your learning, your health. And I think that's interesting because it tells us first that people are able to use a lot of different types of information to come up with a happiness judgment. And it also tells us that people are somewhat predictable in the types of information that they use. That's good news for policymakers. And finally, I think it tells us that it matters how we ask questions about happiness. So today I would like to talk to you a little bit about what happiness is, but also, of course, about how we ask various happiness questions. We use the words subjective well-being, and I'd like to just briefly articulate what that theory says happiness is. According to subjective well-being researchers, happiness consists of two basic parts. One is momentary feelings, both positive and negative affect, pleasant and unpleasant emotions, but physiological feelings in the moment. And the other portion is a construction, a mental construction. It is your global sense of satisfaction with your own life. And it's important that we ask questions about both of these types of things. I think that some critics like to pretend that there are first-class citizens and second-class citizens with regards to happiness. Skeptics are quick to dismiss the role of emotion. They say emotions are temporary and therefore, by definition, superficial. But I would argue quite the opposite. I would argue that emotions are the moments of our everyday life. And in fact, your life is nothing more than an accumulation of all the moments you lived. And I think all those temporary feelings you experience deserve a place at the table. Policymakers, for I think obvious reasons, have long preferenced the more global types of constructions. They've asked about satisfaction, they've asked about life in general. But I'm here to argue in some sense that we should also be asking about moment-to-moment emotions. But let me talk for a moment about what we know about measurement. And let me start with those global measures of life satisfaction. We know that they're pretty good measures, by and large. We know that because they use information, a certain type of information, things like your income, your health, the status of your family, the quality of your relationships with your family, and that those things are relatively stable in life, that we should expect that life satisfaction judgments themselves are relatively stable. And indeed, that is what we find. When we ask people from one year to the next about their life satisfaction, and they give us a particular numerical score, we do in fact find strong stability from year 1 to year 2. In fact, the stability coefficient is about 0.56 in life satisfaction in any 1 year. Now, across 5 years, that stability goes down because, of course, life circumstances change. And if you go to a larger amount of time, 15 years, say, the relationship between scores weakens yet again. We also know that we can look at real-world samples as evidence of the validity of these measures. So, for example, if you look at people who are employed, who make a decent living, who are engaged in happy marriages, they show relatively high satisfaction with life scores. By contrast, if you go and you speak with prisoners and you ask them about their satisfaction, or as I have done, you go and talk to people who are homeless and ask them about their satisfaction, they report very depressed satisfaction scores. And this, I think, is indicative that we're measuring the right thing, that there is some concept validity to our measurements. Some people are a little bit worried about these one-time measures because they think that your current mood could perhaps influence your scores even on these global assessments, and that does happen to a certain extent, but I think it's a relatively minor contribution. So for those of you who are interested in the statistical side of things, we find that about 75% of the variance in life satisfaction scores, that is the variability between people in their answering, we find that about 75% of that is the result of broad, globally accessible information, and only about 15% of their answer is influenced by momentary mood, with the remaining 10% being due to random error. So we have about 75% versus 25%. We also find that these global measures converge very well with non-self-report measures, and I think that's important because there's some skepticism that people are somehow inclined to answer in a way that might not be honest, or they might not pay attention to their own moods, or they might, even more worrisome, be interested in changing their answer in a way that might seek to get more benefits from the government or to seek sympathy from other people. But when I ask you, how is your satisfaction, and then I ask your friends and family members how your satisfaction is, we find pretty good convergence between those types of measures. Your friends and families are likely to agree with you between 0.4 and 0.5, so we find some convergence there. When we turn our attention to emotion as a measure of happiness, however, we find something a little bit different. Typically, we look at emotion and we parse it by two different dimensions. We look at emotion in terms of intensity and frequency. And I'm here today essentially to argue that frequency is a much better measure of your emotional happiness than is intensity. First of all, intensity varies by culture. If you look at emotions as being physiological arousal, you can have highly aroused physiology, things like enthusiasm, joy, excitement, and you can have very low positive emotions, but that are not very physiologically aroused. Things like peace, harmony, connectedness, contentment, and tranquility. Neither of those is the real happiness. But you find among collectivist people and people hailing from Confucian cultures and Pacific Rim cultures, you find that the ideal emotion for them is this low arousal positive emotion. They want to feel good, but they do not want to feel intense. If you go to Latin America, by contrast, you find an ideal for much more engaged, intense emotions. The ideal emotion is much more exuberant. And again, it's not that that's somehow better than what you would find in China, Japan, South Korea, but that you just find these cultural differences in what people aspire to in their emotional states. A better indicator is frequency, and when we go out and we actually measure people's frequency of emotional happiness, as happiness is a mood, we find that most people are happy. We've found this since the 1970s across researchers, across instruments, across research labs. We find that about 80% of people spend the majority of their time mildly happy. So in one study of 210 adults in the United States, they found that only 8% of the respondents said that they were happy less than half of the time. The remaining 92% said half the time or more, and 78% of those said most of the time. Now, interestingly, when these same people were asked about the intensity with which they felt happiness, it was only a 3.2 out of a 6-point scale. While they're feeling happy the preponderance of the time, it is only a very mild happiness that people are feeling most of the time. And by way of evidence, I'll suggest to you that you take stock of today and your own intensity of happiness today. The most emotionally intense event we had today was the protesters. And that was the time that you felt the most physiological arousal. And since then, you've probably wavered between mild boredom, comfort, maybe a little hunger, tiredness, and a little bit of interest, a little bit of amusement, but nothing very aroused, nothing very extreme. I think that the fact that most people say that they're happy is worth questioning at a conference on government policy on happiness. Because if most people are mildly happy, then what more do we need to do? Well, I think that it's important to ask the question because I think the people who are not happy, I think they need help. So I think that part of policy is about removing barriers to happiness. That is, the government can't make the people happy, but the government can create the conditions by which the people can make themselves happy. And by removing barriers to individuals to become happier, I believe that is one good use of government policy. I also think that it's important to look at mood as happiness, that is emotion as happiness, because emotion is predictive of health in a way that global judgments of satisfaction may not be. So in one study done at Carnegie Mellon University, the researchers asked people, how cheerful are you? And people gave just a numeric report of their own cheerfulness. And then they had the inside of their nose swabbed with the rhinovirus, the virus for the common cold. And they were sequestered in a hotel room where they had their snot weighed, where they had their temperature taken, their blood pressure taken. They had all their social interactions completely quarantined. So they were able to just follow who actually objectively got a cold. And it turns out that about 20% of the happiest people got a cold, but 30% of the least happy people got a cold. So in this very controlled study, and this is just one instance, one piece of research in a broader fabric of research, you find that happiness is directly and causally related to improved immune functioning and health, and that is independent of the role of negative affect. That is, negative affect, we know that chronic anger, chronic depression can undermine your health by making you age more, by making you predisposed to chronic heart disease and so forth. But independent, above and beyond that, there is a direct route between the experience of positive affect and health. And I think for that reason alone, it should be a subject of policy interest. I consult sometimes, and one of the companies with which I consult is named Ruby Receptionists. It was twice named the best place to work in the United States of America by Fortune magazine. It's a virtual reception company, so these women, and they're mostly women, they answer the phone on the behalf of your company, pretending to be your company. It's about 150 employees. And they're an incredibly, incredibly happy workplace. If you look at what happy culture means, and you look organizationally at this particular workplace, you'll find smiles all over the place. But I talked to a manager recently, and she told me an interesting story. She said, we have our own intranet that our workers can communicate to one another with. And this intranet system has a bank of emoticons, little faces representing emotions. And we had our computer engineers go in and erase all the negative emoticons. We had them take out all the frowny faces, all the angry faces. And I thought, are you crazy? Why? Why did you do that? And they said, because we thought it would promote happiness. If all people could express was happiness, then they would in fact be happier. But they found exactly the opposite to be true. They found that without real outlets for expressing dissatisfaction, anger, irritation, frustration, disappointment, that these people became emotionally exhausted by having this taxing burden of having to pretend to be happy all the time, even if they were happy 80% of the time. So the management wisely put the sad emoticons and the angry emoticons back into their intranet system. And I will hold that out as an example for the government of Jalisco, for all of you who work in organizations and in policy, because if you think of emotion fundamentally as being a tracking system for your life, giving you sort of a mental thumbs up or thumbs down, telling you how your life is going, we don't want government to mess with that system. And I think that when you hear pushback against happy policy, this is one of the pushbacks you'll hear. We don't want people to not be able to experience sadness anymore. We don't want people just walking around with smiley faces anymore, some kind of American-style happyology. That's not what we're looking for. And if you think then that emotions are just a thermometer and they can measure your life, we don't only want to measure people's happiness alone. That's like breaking the thermometer and saying we're only interested in a few degrees. We want people to experience the widest range of happiness with occasional dissatisfaction and unhappiness. And we want to use that full range of temperature taking, that full thermometer to help guide policy so that we can shift people to mild happiness most of the time and more people can achieve that. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Very interesting presentation. So next we have Daniel Abrion, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at St. Louis University. He has a PhD degree from Rutgers University. His research is centered on ethics and philosophy of psychology, special emphasis on well-being and psychology of well-being. He's the author of a very interesting book that is called The Search of Unhappiness, The Pursuit of Unhappiness, and the elusive psychology of well-being. And he has another book that is called Happiness, a very short introduction. Let's welcome Daniel Abraham, please.
Gracias, buenas tardes. That's all my Spanish, I'm sorry. But it's an honor to be here. Thank you very much. I'm going to try to tell you everything that philosophers have to say about well-being policy in 20 minutes. So we'll see how we do with this. Let's start with the big picture. What does a good society look like? What do we want in a good society? If you ask political philosophers, all we like to talk about is justice. That's the sovereign virtue of a society. And clearly justice is extremely important. It's essential. So suppose you have a just society. Do we now have everything that we need in place? Is that good enough? And I would suggest not. In a just society, everybody gets their due. They get what they're owed. Their rights aren't violated. Ebenezer Scrooge also seems to have met that standard. He paid everybody, he paid his bills. He didn't rip people off. He just was a terrible human being. He was just an awful person. And, if the best you could say for Grandpa is that he was just and he didn't rip anybody off, that would be kind of depressing. There's more to a good society than merely that it be just. And a just society could still be a bad place to live. So beyond that, so what else do we want? Well, here's two candidates that have been very influential. As you know, on the one hand, the standard model for policy has been the focus on resources like GDP, income and wealth. And that's been the standard economic view. And of course, that's important, but we wouldn't be here today if we thought that was all that we needed to look at. Another approach that's been very influential, and partly as a response to the deficiencies of a resource view, is the capabilities approach. The capabilities approach that you see in work of Amartya Sen, Martha Nussbaum, and others basically says what we ought to be focusing on is a kind of freedom. That is giving people opportunities to choose good lives for themselves. And there's a great deal in favor of that perspective. It brings a lot to the table. Both these perspectives are important. But by themselves, we're still not quite there. They don't give us everything that we need. You could have great wealth, you could have great opportunities, the world could be your oyster, yet you could still be miserable. And in fact, you could have that en masse. And there's a number of reasons that this could happen. I'm just going to mention two. On the one hand, people make mistakes, a lot of predictable mistakes. Even smart people with great capabilities and so forth can really mess things up. Second, a lot of the things that are most important for well-being are things that we don't choose as individuals. We don't really have control over them as individuals. I call these non-choice goods or bads. So things like living in a healthy community, having green space and parks, not being subject to really toxic status and positional competition like what's required to get your kid into Harvard nowadays. Wait a minute. We seem to be, sorry. Okay. So basically, if we just look at our resources and our freedoms, we're still missing an important part of the puzzle, the outcomes. How do people's lives actually go? And good policymaking has to pay attention to outcomes. It's actually kind of weird that this should even be controversial. If you know that your policies are going to make people's lives worse, then you have to take account of that information. It would be irresponsible not to. And another way of saying that is just that we need well-being policy. And by well-being policy, I just mean policy that aims directly at promoting well-being or reducing ill-being. Now, what do we mean by well-being? Well-being is basically it's a value concept that has to do with a kind of value, so it's like virtue or morality, but it concerns what's good for you, what benefits you, what makes your life go well for you. And other terms for well-being include welfare, Bienestar, utility, flourishing, eudaimonia. Sometimes we use the word happiness to talk about well-being, as in translating ancient philosophy like Aristotle's, and that's fine, but most researchers today, and people you've been hearing, use happiness more narrowly to talk about a state of mind, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. So what do we mean by well-being? What actually is good for people ultimately? In the philosophical literature, there are three basic views to choose from. On the one hand, hedonism, and that doesn't mean go out and party all night necessarily, unless that works for you. What it really means is just that what matters ultimately for the quality of your life is how pleasant or unpleasant your experience is. A more popular theory among philosophers, and extremely popular, the standard view among economists, is desire theories of well-being, which basically says ultimately what's good for you is getting what you want. And if you want things other than being happy, then fine, those things count too. And then finally, objectivist theories basically say that what's good for you is not just a matter of your attitudes. So there's list theories that basically say, what's ultimately good for you is things like knowledge, achievement, and so forth. But a more influential view, especially among eudaimonic researchers and psychologists, is the idea of well-being as fulfilling your nature. Aristotle is the paradigm of this. For Aristotle, well-being or flourishing is a matter of realizing your potential, the excellent exercise of your human capacities, leading a fully human life, being all you can be. So now let's look at an example so you can see how these things really make a difference in practice. Imagine two societies that seem to have different values for their lives. On the one hand, I'll call New Orleans an enjoyer culture. They're more interested in the enjoyment of life. On the other hand, take New York City, call that a striver culture. They're more interested in working hard and achieving things. Now, suppose you find out, as actually research has suggested, that people are happier in New Orleans than in New York. They have higher subjective well-being. Can we conclude that the people in New Orleans are better off? If hedonism is true, then absolutely, they're definitely better off. If desire theory is true, maybe, maybe not. It depends on whether people are getting what they want. New Yorkers want different things than New Orleanians, so they might be equally well off. If you're an objectivist, again, it depends. How important is achievement compared to enjoyment? And how important are the kind of achievements you get in New York compared to enjoyment? It may be that New Yorkers are actually better off than New Orleanians on that kind of a theory. So the theories really make a difference. And now, we philosophers leave you guys with a problem, which is the experts don't have a consensus on what's the right view of well-being. All of these theories are live options in the literature. There's no consensus on it. So what are you supposed to do? What are policymakers supposed to do? What I would suggest is actually that the policymakers can avoid the philosophical debates. You can set them aside because instead of assuming a controversial theory of well-being, let citizens themselves be the judges of what's ultimately important for them. Make their own values the standard of well-being for them for policy. So even if some theory of well-being is the correct one, what you promote is well-being as citizens themselves see it. This is a view that Valerie Tiberius and I have been developing called pragmatic subjectivism. And so looking at New Orleans, you promote enjoyment. In New York, you focus more on achievement. One nice thing about this framework is it's not paternalistic. Another nice thing about it is that you don't have to worry about the philosophical debates, which everybody except philosophers likes. The upshot for policy is essentially that we need to pay twofold, really. We have to pay attention to what citizens actually value. And not just by looking at their market behavior, like their shopping behavior. People might be great shoppers, but they still end up on their deathbed at the end of their lives wondering where it all went wrong. You want to know really ultimately what do people care about. And one way to find out is to listen to them. Ask them, what do they value? What do they want for their lives? Do rural people all want to live in the city and work in a factory? Or do some of them want actually policies that will make life easier for them in where they are now? Second, and most importantly, promote and respect people's values in policy. And a trick here is that given that people have lots of different values, people's values are diverse, policy is going to want to especially focus on widely shared values. For example, nobody really objects to healthcare policy because nobody wants malaria. Nobody's going to object to getting rid of malaria because whatever your values, it's a bad thing. And this is why subjective well-being is a great target for policy. And this is, so I'm going to really kind of push for subjective well-being metrics here, because everybody cares about it. Everybody cares about happiness. I've heard a lot of New Yorkers say they don't care about happiness, but if they really didn't care about happiness, they wouldn't all be in therapy. So I think in general, as a crude rule of thumb, it seems plausible that if people are unhappy, they're probably not doing well by their standards. If people are happy, they're probably doing pretty well by their standards. There's exceptions, but it's not a bad rule of thumb. If you find out, for instance, that South Korea is unhappy, and it kind of looks that way, that's just patently important. And you don't have to, their values are different from American values, but nobody wants to be miserable. Subjective well-being, then, is really handy as a headline measure of well-being, as a kind of convenient snapshot of how people are doing. It's not the only metric that matters. The other speakers, I can't see anything that the other speakers have been talking about that we shouldn't be concerned with. We should be concerned with lots of different measures, but subjective well-being is, to my mind, a good candidate for the thing that should get the most attention, or at least our best single summary indicator. Now, I'm talking about actually as a single indicator, but in fact, subjective well-being is a broad rubric, an umbrella term for several different things that are closely related. And so I'm going to break it down into 3 components, a little differently from the way some of my colleagues do, but I think this is a helpful way of doing it. Each different metric of subjective well-being corresponds to a different theory of happiness. And by the way, among the philosophers who work on happiness, I'm one of them, there is not a consensus on how to define happiness. There are multiple definitions that all have currency in the literature. So the first one is basically life satisfaction or life evaluation. And this is not really about your feelings. What makes it important is that it has to do with your judgment about how your life is going relative to what you care about. In a democracy, this is a really important thing to be paying attention to. And it includes whatever people value, not just their hedonic values. So if you live in a collectivist society and what you care about is more the community than yourself or your family than yourself, then that'll be reflected in your life evaluation. Second, hedonic balance. The mere fact that so many smart people continue to think that pleasure is the only thing that matters, and they're not crazy, is good evidence that hedonic balance, how pleasant people's lives are, is an important consideration for policy. And I think these kind of metrics are especially helpful in the context of time use surveys, where we want to know, are we allocating time to pleasant activities, or are we allocating too much time to unpleasant activities like commuting? Third is emotional well-being, which often gets run together with hedonic balance, but it's really a different thing. And basically you can think of emotional well-being, this is, by the way, is what I believe to be the most defensible understanding of happiness, but again, that's not a consensus view yet. So we can think of emotional well-being as sort of a positive emotional health, sort of like the opposite of anxiety and depression. So it includes states like joy, vitality, flow, peace of mind, as opposed to anxiety, depression, stress, fear, anger, and so forth. And one way of seeing the difference between this and hedonic balance measures is to think about a study of unemployed people that was done in Germany. What they found was, as you'd expect, the unemployed people were less satisfied with their lives, and they seemed to have lower emotional well-being. They had a harder time enjoying the same activities as people who had jobs. Yet their experience, the measured experience, was not less pleasant, to the extent that we could tell, than people with jobs. What's going on? Probably that they were having emotional distress from being unemployed, but they masked that by reallocating their time to, instead of being at the office in a boring meeting, they're playing video games at home, which is just a little more fun. And so it really is a different thing. Here's my conjecture. This is an empirical question that is open to further study, but given sufficiently reliable measures, I would conjecture that emotional well-being might be the best single indicator of overall well-being, thinking of mood as a robust summary of recent conditions. I'm not going to read through this whole list, but just to give you a sense of what an emotional well-being measure might look like. This is a mock scale that hasn't been tested. I've just highlighted a few of the more interesting questions, and it's based on mental health questionnaires, because mental health researchers have been particularly interested in emotional well-being, but they've been focused on the negative end of things. So are you able to enjoy things and laugh? Do you get upset easily? These, by the way, are some of the cues that we use in our daily lives to figure out whether our family members are happy or not, or unhappy. So now I want to turn to the question, are these measures reliable enough for policy? Naturally, a lot of people are skeptical. I've spilled a lot of ink in my own research about all sorts of problems that I see in measures. For our purposes today, I think we can set that aside and just boil it down to a simple answer. Yes, they're reliable enough for policy. These measures should be used in policy now, and it's great to see Jalisco taking steps to do that. So basically, John and Robert especially have already shown how these measures give reliable information. And I think all 3 of the metrics I talked about deserve a place at the table. They're they all give us useful information. And I do want to mention very briefly a common objection that people do have is it may be that most people are happy, and part of it is that we have different definitions of happiness. But if you're worried, or if people come to you worried that maybe the self-reports are too inflated, people are reporting too positively, my own sense is that actually there is a positive bias in the reports. The reports tend to overstate how happy people are. I don't think that's a big problem. Think of it this way. Imagine you have a really accurate thermometer. It's a great thermometer, but they put the labels in the wrong places. So it always reads 10 degrees too high. That's still a really useful thermometer, and you just have to keep the limitations in mind. And all measures have limitations. As long as you use them appropriately and don't misread them, they'll do a lot of work for you. Especially in a development context, I often hear people say a lot of skepticism, and actually political philosophers really hate happiness. I don't know what it is. Philosophers are kind of a miserable kvetchy bunch anyway. Kvetchy probably doesn't translate well, sorry. But think of it, so why should we focus on happiness given so much injustice and poverty? Well, actually, I think those are excellent places to focus well-being policy. Not just there, we should care about other things as well. But I live 10 minutes away from Ferguson, Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri. You may have heard about, actually, as far as I know right now, people are attacking my car, depending on the verdict in this case of a police shooting. People are really upset there, and they're protesting injustice. But why are they in the streets protesting? Because their quality of life is terrible. Bad governance in spades. Just mention one thing. There are all these little towns that they can't raise enough taxes, so they use the police to do it. One town has 26 arrest warrants outstanding per resident at a time. Ferguson itself has 3 arrest warrants per resident. There's something wrong with that picture. So where do we focus, given that there's so much injustice? Where do we focus our efforts? How about the places where it's doing the most harm? People in Ferguson, purely in monetary terms, they're much wealthier than the people, the Dongria Khand in India, who just rejected development, basically. They said, we like the way we live. We have basically no income, we don't care. We're happy with our kind of poverty. The kind of poverty in Ferguson carries with it an immense amount of suffering, and well-being policy can help to improve that. And just going to get in something more positive. I want to end on a positive note here. So basically, there's a tendency to think that well-being policy to focus on small things like people talk about banning large sodas and so forth, and they make it sound like government's just going to micromanage our lives. It doesn't have to. And I actually think the real action lies at a deeper level where government is already involved, they can't help but be involved. In particular, I'm especially interested in lifestyle infrastructure. That is the way institutions, the environment, and norms shape the way we live. In the United States, our food subsidies shape the way we eat, and they're currently making us sick and overweight. In regimes regarding the work week and vacation time have enormous effects on quality of life. Urban planning, how we design our communities, shapes just about everything, has an enormous effect. And in the United States, our model of development has been focused on building places like what I call tin palms. This is an actual community, if you can call it that, near where I live, where it's basically a cul-de-sac with 4,000 square foot McMansions inhabited by 3 people, and I think the daughter is off in the children's wing putting cigarette burns in her arms or something. And no trees, no sense of community. Actually, there are trees. The only 3 trees I could really see were palm trees. I thought that was kind of odd in Missouri. As it turns out, they're made of metal. This is the most horrible place I've ever been where I wasn't afraid of being stabbed or shot. And policy doesn't have to build places like that. We can, and I think a good society is one that fosters the conditions that promote human well-being rather than the conditions that frustrate it. Thank you. Passes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Daniel Hebron, for this very interesting intervention and the very interesting concept that you just shared with the audience. Next, we will have Dr. Gordon Matthews, who will present his speech. He comes from Hong Kong. He's an anthropology professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and he has written a book titled What Makes Life Worth Living and How Japanese and Americans Make Sense of Their Own Worlds. And he has also co-edited The Pursuits of Happiness, Well-Being in an Anthropological Perspective. So please welcome Professor Gordon Matthews. Thank you, Professor Gordon, for being here today.
Happiness, quality of life, and well-being. What are they? Happiness, quality of life, and well-being are terms with quite different meanings and connotations. Quality of life typically is measured by indices like the Human Development Index, a statistic of life expectancy, education, and income. Journals like the Quality of Life Research typically deal with matters of rehabilitation and medical care. Quality of life, as these indicate, is primarily based on objective measures, examining something that others can assess about a given person by looking at variables others, not just how the person, he or she himself, feels. Happiness, on the other hand, is typically thought of as subjective. Who but a given individual can say whether an individual is happy or not? As a stereotypical fragment of conversation in English has it, I think she's crazy. But if it makes her happy, what can I say? Happiness, unlike quality of life, is typically deemed to be something that others can't assess about a person. Only that person oneself can know the state of happiness. If quality of life represents the objective pole of research into well-being, then happiness represents the subjective pole. This is because while we can see and measure indicators of quality of life, the only way we can get at happiness is by asking people about how happy they are in their lives. There's some question about whether people can accurately assess their happiness, but there's no other way to get at individual happiness except by asking people how happy they are. Aside from this, the major problem with happiness as an investigative term is that it carries different meanings. In English, happiness may, for some, evoke thoughts of a good meal, for others a nice car, for others a good marriage, and for others a good relation with God. These different forms of happiness are not the same, despite being covered by a common term. And this is also true for the equivalents to happiness in language others than English. Questions about happiness in surveys potentially mix up short-term and long-term happiness, and also, when asked cross-linguistically and cross-culturally, mix up the different semantic domains of happiness in different languages. Well-being is in the middle. It's a term that splits the difference between experience far quality of life and experience near happiness. One can speak of objective well-being, which involves measures similar to that of quality of life, or subjective well-being involving individuals' own senses of their lives. Questions concerning subjective well-being are often phrased in such a way as to try to minimize the cross-cultural semantic squishiness of a term like happiness. This does not solve the problems of cultural difference, as we'll discuss, but it does enable more cross-cultural comparability, in the sense that life satisfaction is a somewhat more objective and universalistic term than happiness. We thus see two domains of analysis: that of evaluations by objective markers, as connoted by quality of life, and objective well-being, and evaluation by people themselves in their appraisal of their happiness and subjective well-being. One important point that's already been mentioned is that these two areas are not necessarily congruent. Quality of life and happiness are certainly linked, with a high measure of the former logically leading to a high measure of the latter, but this may not be true. An individual might be brimming with health and wealth and yet be miserably unhappy, leading to suicide. One of the interesting riddles of happiness research is that of why some societies that score comparatively lower on measures like the Human Development Index score relatively higher on measures of happiness, and why other societies might be high on the Human Development Index and relatively low. For example, as was pointed out earlier, Mexicans scored higher than Americans in happiness, and Thais scored higher than Japanese in the 213 version of the World Happiness Report that John put together. The reasons for such discrepancies are undoubtedly tied to very particular cultural factors requiring detailed analysis. But the nub of the issue is that while objective and subjective measures of well-being are indeed largely correlated in different societies, they're not entirely correlated. There's a realm of social, cultural, and historical context that must be considered. Now, how can quality of life, happiness, well-being be measured? Quality of life is the easiest term to measure because it typically involves the comparison of objective criteria. The investigator can compare individual health outcomes or societies in terms of the Human Development Index or other measures. There's nothing controversial about this. The objective side of well-being is also readily measurable and comparable through a wide variety of measures. However, when it comes to happiness and its close correlate, subjective well-being, these measures become more problematic. Typically, measurements done through surveys. Prominent surveys ask, for example, for respondents to rate their life satisfaction on a scale of 0 to 10. This effort at statistical measurement seems on the surface to be straightforward, but can statistical measures of well-being yield the kind of transparent and objective comparison that their proponents seek? Kahneman and Kruger have written, "One of the difficulties of using data on subjective well-being is that individuals may interpret the response categories differently. If Jim says that he's very satisfied and Tim says that he's only satisfied, is Jim really more satisfied than Tim? Maybe, but maybe Tim is the type of person who rarely uses superlatives to describe himself, either when he's jubilant or depressed, while Jim tends to extremes in his self-description. To put it another way, when Tim answers a 4 about the intensity of a particular emotion, maybe that's the equivalent of a 6 for Jim." Kruger and Kahneman offer an alternative measure, the U-index, for measuring the mood of respondents over a more extended period. In a similar vein, Diener discusses how subjective well-being should be measured not just in terms of life satisfaction, but also in terms of domains like work and family. These approaches show how the study of well-being is becoming progressively more sophisticated, but they don't fully solve the problem that Kahneman and Kruger identify. Can statistical measures of well-being be transparently valid, or are these measurements too prone to the variables of subjective interpretation to be truly valuable, to be truly reliable? There's even greater difficulties when comparing well-being across societal and cultural bounds. In Diener and Sue's book, Culture and Subjective Well-Being, one chapter asks, why are North Americans happier than East Asians? This question assumes that statistical surveys reflect the reality of happiness or its lack, rather than being the product of the surveys themselves. In a society like the United States, declaring in one of its founding documents the inalienable right to the pursuit of happiness, its members may seem culturally required to pursue and proclaim happiness in order to be fully American. In societies like Japan, on the other hand, personal modesty is a key social value. One should not boast about one's success. One should not declare too loudly one's own happiness. To proclaim happiness, even on an anonymous survey, is bad manners. And I've lived in Japan a long time. This is clearly the case. Thus, it seems plausible that North Americans are not happier than East Asians, but are simply more willing to proclaim their happiness on a survey form. Now, psychologists investigating well-being have become progressively more aware of these difficulties. Diener, Oishi, and Lucas note how North Americans may engage in self-enhancement more than East Asians, contributing to this difference in reports of subjective well-being. And they talk about impression management in different societies. Nonetheless, scholars of well-being continue to argue that the effects of culture on well-being is not especially pronounced. Diener, Oishi, and Lucas, for example, maintain that between-nation differences amount to 12% to 15% of variance in life satisfaction. This implies that overemphasis on cultural difference in the measurement of well-being cross-culturally is misguided. But to use survey results that may be culturally problematic to demonstrate that culture does not matter leads to the downplaying of culture as a foregone conclusion. The situation is like that of a joke about a man searching for his car keys at night. He is asked, "Where did you lose your car keys?" He points into the blackness, "Over there." "Well, why are you looking for them here?" "The light's better here." This doesn't mean in any way to respect the scholars assembled here, many of whom are pioneers in the study of happiness in their disciplines. But it is to suggest that perhaps the answer to the problem of cross-cultural statistical measurement lies not in further statistical measurement, but rather to move beyond such measurement. A necessary additional form of investigation is ethnographic interviewing. In interpreting statistics comparing well-being across societies, anthropologists and linguists who have expert cultural knowledge of these different societies must be consulted. There are two problems in the cross-cultural statistical measurement of happiness. The first is translation. The term for happiness or life satisfaction in one language may have subtly different nuances in another, affecting the data of surveys. Surveys purporting to statistically compare happiness cross-culturally must acknowledge and account for these differences. A term like life satisfaction may be more easily translatable cross-culturally, but still may be problematic, since in some societies the term may appear alien and experience distant, while in other societies it may not, and this will lead to subtly skewed survey results. But the problem is not only linguistic. There's also the broader problem of cultural understanding, whereby the cultural context of happiness and well-being must be fully understood in any given society in order to make sense of statistical measurements of happiness. How much does happiness matter in a given society? In some societies, it matters more than in others, and this itself must be known, aside from the particular ways that happiness in its cultural constructions differ in different places. For this reason, cross-cultural analysis of happiness must be done through the ethnographic interviewing of individuals, as well as on a statistical basis through cross-cultural surveys. These interviews, done in depth and thoroughly analyzed, can bring a great wealth of knowledge about the complexities of individual lives, as lived within social, cultural, and institutional contexts. Statistical surveys alone can't provide this. Now, it would take a lot of effort and expense to include individual interviews within cross-cultural statistical surveys, but probably not as much as might be imagined. If interviewees are carefully chosen to form an accurate representation of the population of a given society in things like gender, age, income, education level, and religious belief or its lack, then I think that between 50 to 150 interviews would be sufficient in a given society, depending on its population and variation, to provide a fairly detailed depiction of individual senses of happiness. Now, these interviews should not be analyzed in terms of statistical analysis, but rather in terms of discourse analysis. You can't add up how many people think this and how many think that. You've got to look at how they say what they say. That's what would have to be analyzed. This can provide a thorough sociocultural grounding to the uncontextualized statistics of many psychological, sociological, and economic analyses of well-being. Now, there's a number of ways in which such interviews might be conducted, but let me offer a simple prototype. These interviews could be conducted in one session or in two sessions, and they could cover such things as a person's life history, Tell me the story of your life. What's happened to you over the course of your life? Tell me about your work, family, friends, hopes, dreams, fears, religious beliefs. Also, a person's senses of happiness. How do you view your life? Are you happy? Are you satisfied or dissatisfied with your life? Talk about the story of your life over length in terms of your happiness and unhappiness. What does happiness mean for you? And then 3, a person's sense of what happiness means in their society. How do people in your society typically think of a happy life? Are they like you in your thinking or different from you? Who do you know who's most happy and why? Who do you know who's least happy and why? Do you see your society as being a happy society? In what ways, yes. In what ways, no. Questions like these can enable the interviewer to both discover how a given society, a given individual views and pursues life and happiness, and also how he or she views his or her society and its happiness. Views which individually might not mean much, but taken in aggregate can mean a very great deal in analysis. Now, interviews would need to be recorded, transcribed, and translated. Also, notes would need to be taken concerning individuals' facial and bodily expressions to questions. In addition to interviews, researchers would need to examine popular and scholarly writings on happiness in each given society. They would need to read self-help books in that society, magazines, watch movies, watch television, to find out what the prevailing discourses of happiness are. Investigators would also need to understand the historical backgrounds of each given society, including religious belief, gender and familial relations, and social class formations. This would have to be understood before interviewing takes place. It's essential that the interviewer thoroughly understand both the spoken and written language of interviewees so that the nuances of interviewees can be comprehended without the need for interpretation. In short, interviewers should not be globalists hopping from society to society. Rather, each should be an expert on the particular society being investigated. Now, in this way, a full cultural portrait could emerge from the interviews conducted in a given society. A portrait that could give a rich contextual backdrop to the findings of statistical surveys. In the final analysis, statistical survey results and ethnographic findings would need to be combined so that the former could provide the latter with breadth and the latter could provide the former with depth. Only through this analytical combination can the statistical and the ethnographic be usefully merged in arriving at suitably subtle and nuanced portraits of happiness in different societies. Now, the third and final question here is, should quality of life, well-being, and happiness even be studied at all? And I think we need to think about that. The answer might be no. I've discussed how the study of quality of life, well-being, and happiness should proceed. But let me now discuss whether or not these kinds of investigations should even be conducted. Few would object to knowledge of quality of life or objective well-being. Indicators of life expectancy, infant mortality, educational attainment, and other such markers are generally unobjectionable, although governments and NGOs may occasionally play with the data to make them appear this or make them appear that. These statistics are of great importance because they indicate as a whole what a society must do to improve its objective well-being. But should governments be concerned with their citizens' subjective well-being or happiness? Should governments take steps to try to make their citizens happier? Surveys alone typically don't explain why individuals in a society are happy or unhappy. But interviews could indeed enable a greater knowledge of the sources of unhappiness. A liberal government could, upon studying the findings of such interviews, work to rectify the causes of such happiness. For example, in interviews, individuals might say that one large reason for their unhappiness is, for example, the gap between rich and poor. I'll never be able to buy a house and start a family with the money I make, but that guy over there has rich parents. He can buy 10 houses. It's not fair. Or discrimination against women. I'll never be a company executive however hard I work. Yes, I'm frustrated. It shouldn't be this way. Or work-life balance. I have to spend all my time at work so that I can almost never be with my family. That's not right. These social problems, of course, can't easily be solved, but if a government takes them seriously, then they can at least be worked on. Surveys, too, of a subtler sort, covering not simply degree of life satisfaction, but an array of other domains, can also get at these areas, particularly in conjunction with interviews. But there's another way to promote happiness that's far more dangerous. Change not the conditions of society, but rather the conditions of citizens' minds. Michel Foucault has written of how Western societies, in a dark parallel to the French Enlightenment, moved from disciplining citizens through punishment to measuring them against a norm of health and wellness and judging them to be sick if they did not conform to these guidelines. This, he implies, is a far more insidious form of state control. Nicholas Rose has discussed how psychology has become, in the late 20th century, a mechanism of state control over individual minds, creating what he calls governable subjects. Will the study of quality of life, well-being, and happiness lead to further forms of indirect yet insidious control? Will the kinds of studies reported on in this conference lead to the reshaping of social conditions in order to make people happier, or rather to the reshaping of minds to make people happier? If the former is the case, then the moral basis for the study of happiness is largely unproblematic. But if the latter is the case, then this moral basis is indeed problematic, and perhaps these studies should not be done. We as researchers cannot control the uses to which our findings may be put, but we must be aware and vigilant that our research may be used in ways that increase the power of governments and corporations, not to enlighten us, but to manipulate us. This danger has markedly increased because of the development of pharmacology. There are increasingly effective and inexpensive drugs on the market to make people feel happy. One thinks of Aldous Huxley's book, Brave New World, with its soma, a drug making everybody in the novel, except for its malcontent protagonist, happy. If professional therapists and psychiatrists seek to make their clients happy, there are an increasingly large range of pharmaceuticals through which they can do just that. The first major development in this movement was Prozac. One can imagine an ever more sophisticated pharmacological future in which individuals seek out their therapists for an ever-increasing array of pills to make their clients happier and happier, or where governments dispense pills or injections or altered water supplies or air currents to make their citizens happy. This will be the wave of the future, but taking place with far more subtlety than Huxley imagined, increasingly forcing us all to be happy. A student of mine this year approached me with a broad smile. She said, "I don't want to be smiling. I hate smiling. The doctor gave me drugs for my depression, and so now I have to smile. But I hate this. This isn't who I am." As the drugs prescribed to people like her become more and more effective, people like her may become happier in their drug state. The drugs will seem less and less foreign and more intrinsic to oneself, like one's glasses, something that no one would ever object to having. Happiness is not the highest human value. I repeat, happiness is not the highest human value. And it's profoundly important that human beings retain the right to be unhappy, the right to feel miserable if they are in that situation. Governments everywhere should strive to maximize the objective conditions for happiness. The less premature death, the more education, the more of all of these attributes, the better. However, governments and professional authorities must stay away past a certain necessary minimum from manipulating the subjective consciousness of happiness. Such manipulation can destroy our humanity. Thank you.
thank you. How interesting these concepts. I remember this slogan that says everybody's entitled their own unhappiness. So prior to yielding the floor now to our last speaker of this panel, I want to say that a while ago, one of the wallet of one of our speakers got lost, and the fact is that it appears so we have no unhappy people among us. So now I want to introduce to you Wenceslao Unanue. He is a member of the Institute of Wellbeing and Action for Happiness. He's a researcher of Success University, and he's a member of the group of international experts that cooperate with Bhutan and the UN on this new paradigm based on happiness and well-being. And he's professor of Adolfo Ibáñez University in Chile. Welcome, Wenceslao. Good afternoon. First of all, I wanted to thank our friends from Jalisco for having invited us to such a big event. And something I would like to do is to tell you briefly about why is it that we need a new development paradigm, and why especially we need a new development paradigm based on happiness. If we look at the status of human well-being, and I want to show you very specific data. Today we are wealthier than ever. At least in the Western world, it is enough to see the GDP that the Western world has had, and it is only that we consider technological advances, health. In terms of health, there are diseases that we thought would never be cured, and today are cured. We have set the man on the moon. We have been able nowadays. It is only for us to have a credit card, and then we can buy goods anywhere in the world. So, despite all this, and by taking the words of former Minister of Bhutan, despite the fact that we are wealthier than ever and we have this great technological social progress, the world is living this very big problem, and now the future of the world is at stake. So in this regards, and at least I have to say, there are 5 very big problems that are setting the future of the planet at stake. And I could tell you so much, and I would take hours to talk about this. But I have to tell you, poverty. Poverty is the main or the top problem. If we consider figures about poverty, it is enough to see what's happening in the world, and we can say that there is at least 1 billion people living in less than $2.2 a day, and we have more than a third of the planet, of the people of the planet living in poverty. This is the map of the world, and the reddest, fortunately, we have some countries that are not as red. The redder the color is, the poorer the country is. And there are some countries that have 70-80% poverty, and there are places where children and people die on a daily basis. And then if we get to inequality. Inequality is another very big problem, and I will tell you about some coincidences. These are not happy coincidences between Mexico and Chile. If we take the whole world and we compare 20% of the wealthiest population and compare it to the 20th poorest population, what we observe is the 20% wealthiest, they consume 86% of the goods, and the 20% poorest, they consume less than 1%, and this is totally unacceptable. So these are data from the end of the last decade, and several of the countries of the OECD. We have seen coincidence, as I said, between Chile and Mexico. Mexico is the most unequal country in the OECD, and they are fighting to rank first with Mexico. And I was checking why is it we have this data from the last years of the past decade, and I got to review the last OECD's report, Society at a Glance, from 2014, and it's exactly the same. Probably you won't be able to see the screen, but you can see that they are ranking, they are competing for ranking last, Mexico and Chile, in terms of inequality. Why is important to talk about inequality, and most than anything to relate it to happiness and public policies? I was lucky, and there are more people, of course, that we were invited to go to Bhutan a couple of years ago, and I was very lucky to meet with them. They are Richard Wilkinson and Kate Piquet, and they wrote this book that is so wonderful, that is called The Spirit Level. And one of the things that we were shown at Bhutan, they are here in this picture that we took as a group, this group photo that we took in this meeting that lasted for a week. Richard and Kate proved something remarkable, and it is that when inequality data correlate to social problems, and we could think problems that probably tell us if a society is more or less happiness, the correlation is almost perfect. On the below the axis, you can see there is inequality, and the further to the right, countries are more unequal, and the vertical level, what they have is social problems, and we almost find perfect correlation. So inequality is not a problem just to say, oh, my heart aches because there's poor people who suffer, who don't have the same as I do. And no, this is social problems, and this is very large social problems. And this is a chart taken from Richard and Kate's book, and it proves that societies, the more unequal they are, they have a set of issues that go from learning rate, but also they link to violence, and they link to homicide, to mental disease, to sustainability, and so on. So that's why inequality is not only a topic of being good people or suffer when the other suffers. No, it's also linked to the societies and the capacities of societies to be happy. And with these levels of inequality we have in my country, we cannot name ourselves as a happy society. Then we have mental health. It suffices to see how the levels of stress and depression have increased. It has been said that at least 700 million people suffer from depression, and it is true that there are many places in the world that it cannot be even measured. So that depends on how anxiety and depression can be measured. It can rank from 30 to 70% of the people, and it is mostly young people between 15 to 18 years of age who have doubled their levels of anxiety in the last few years. So we also should talk about climate change and global warming. Ban Ki-moon, who is the General Secretary of the United Nations, opening the summit, the climate summit, just a few months ago. And what he was posing is something that reports are tired to say, that climate change and environmental crisis is probably one of the biggest challenges we have faced as a humankind. And there are data that prove that if we don't change our consumerism levels, we would need 3 planets by the year 2040. In terms of power consumption, it is said that we consume power 30% more than what that can be recovered, and that will yield into problems. We won't be able to keep the quality of life or the life pace we have kept so far. Now, about governance, Syria's crisis, Iraq's crisis, the same that is happening here in Mexico, and so many other countries with problems. So you see this UN secretary when he opened this one of the summits a very few years ago, and the the UN Security Council, he started by saying something very interesting. He said, it seems the world is crumbling down, and from the Second World War, the world has never ever seen so many problems together as we are witnessing right now. So These are problems. As I said, at least these 5 problems are very severe problems, and we never give us enough time to reflect upon them. But there is something else. There is something besides all this, and I would like to stress out. And I think it is truly important, and sometimes we don't consider it as important. And it has to do with images as this one. These images have been taken by Forbes. Forbes, they say that there is a percentage, and they say most of employees in the United States feel dissatisfied with their work. Or it seems I skipped one screen, but okay, there's another one showing how much employees are eager to leave their company. Says this is an example that caught my attention. I was living in the UK when Mercer consultant office published this report, and they called it Happy New Year. Why? And they asked people or prior to coming back to work after vacation, they were declaring themselves miserable, sad, depressive, anxious, only because they had to go back to their companies. Now imagine Chile. In Chile, we made a survey a while ago, and data we obtained are very similar to this. Almost 60% of employees in our country declare themselves unhappy, and this matches with this report issued by Gallup, and it is from a couple of years ago that is called the State of the Global Workplace, and it shows that in a couple of years, I studied 2011, 2012, it shows how many employees are truly engaged with their companies at work, and this is impressive. It shows that less than 30% are truly engaged and involved in their companies. And when we measure high levels of engagement to their companies, it is only less than 15%. 13% of people are truly engaged to their companies, when it has been proved that when companies engage people better, they not only improve the mental health of these employees, but also they can yield more productivity and they increase return. So why am I showing you all this information? Because sometimes we are not aware, especially from a public policy standpoint, that there are so many things we could do to improve the quality of life of people, and this also relates to improving the quality of life at companies and at the job place, at the workplace. Because just think about how many hours we spend of our active life we spend at work, at our job place. So it is why it is so important that we say that the workplace influences our quality of life. In Chile, there is a study that is called something about labor, and it assesses stress levels in people, and they found, and it is only 2013, 2014, but percentages are very similar. Orange and red measure those people who feel kind of stressed or very stressed, and it is practically more than 80% of Chilean population, according to this survey, they declare they are mildly or truly stressed on a daily basis, and this impacts their quality of life, and they also impact their happiness, and that's why the science of happiness has lots to contribute in this scope. And that's why we know we need a new development paradigm, because the traditional development paradigm is based on income, on materialism, on GDP, but we have also realized that we have to go one step further. We have to approach a paradigm that places human being by the core and its relationship to the environment. So that's why the UN in June 2011, when this resolution was adopted, and this is one of the most remarkable, and this was established when the members were together, passing this resolution that places happiness by the core of public policies, and they encourage the states to promote policies that have to do with happiness, with measuring, with foster it, because it proposes that happiness has to reach the maximum or top levels of human aspirations. Why happiness? And this is very brief what I want to show you now. It is truly simple, because if we consider advancements on what Richard Lyer has called the new science of happiness, Happiness and its study is not new. What is new is that we have a set of disciplines getting together: psychology, neurosciences, economy, philosophy, institutions, and so on. And there are great personalities working on this, and I have only said some of the faces. Great personalities working on the science of happiness now. And what they have uncovered is that happiness makes us good, makes us well. In what sense? It is because happiness has this virtuous circle. And this paper written by Robert's father, along with Liz Tai, for this Bhutan group that we worked with, that we have been working for this new paradigm for development, I find this remarkable because they make the briefing on the benefits of happiness. And there are so many papers published in this sense, but here they prove that the happiest people not only, as it was shown here, they not only enjoy better physical and mental health, but they are also able to construct better social relations. They link in better ways to their work, to their jobs, to their companies, and they yield more by the end. And something which is very important for the challenges we have as a humanity, as a human kind, is that it has been uncovered that the happier people look to address poverty, to reduce inequality, and to protect the environment. So just to wrap up, just to start to wrap up, I would like to show a couple of data on studies we have performed in Chile. And the first, it is about if it is true that happier people contribute more to the environment. And it truly called my attention. This paper written by Catherine Brown, I was able to work with this in my PhD, and it's from 2005. And it is because many people think that happiness cannot be matched to sustainability, because if I want to take care of the environment, at the end it's going to take so much effort. I'm not going to be happy if this is going to be linked to the environment. So they don't match. So, but this paper, at least in correlation, it finds true match, and it finds significant correlations between sustainability, or those people protecting the environment, and people who are happier. So what we wanted to do, it is because most of the papers published about happiness and that explore behavior for the environment is that they have done this from the correlational standpoint, taken the subjective well-being as a whole. And we wanted to go beyond in order to see if there was this predictability from the longitudinal standpoint. And what we found from the UK sample is that there is predictability. We can say that longitudinally the happiest people, or at least those with the largest subjective well-being, they protect more the environment, and that's why happiness is relevant for the future of our planet. And the next is a study we worked on a very while ago. If it is true that happiness truly improves job life. And obviously, it is not one, but one of the most popular models about happiness is the Martin Seligman model that Martin Seligman has called PERMA. PERMA, due to the acronym in English, each one is a component of happiness. P is positive emotions, E is for involvement, R is for relations to others, M is meaning of life, and A is achievement. So, in this group, I was also lucky enough to meet Alejandro Adler, and I asked him, in your group, because he was also working with his PhD with Seligman, he said, in the group you're working also with organizations? And he said yes, and he very generously set me in touch with the people who are working on this in Pennsylvania with Peggy Care. And it was precisely during this time when they were developing the first validation of PERMA survey in the world. So they, in Chile, allowed us to be a part of this international valoration, and we started working, flourishing, and organization development in Chile. So I wanted to show some data. What do we prefer? Would we prefer to start by the finance sector? We prefer to do that because in Chile, as well as in Mexico, I imagine, and many other countries, it's one of the hardest to work with. actually from the security department in our country, they decided that we started by checking the financial. And in order to be specific, what did we do? We started comparing the happiest people with the least happy people. And what we found at every scope, and I will show you due to time-related issues, very, very briefly, if we take job satisfaction from the happiest people, almost 20%, it's almost 20% higher compared to the least happy. And we have also found that work satisfaction is a great predictor of productivity. And now, in terms of labor productivity, we found something similar. Almost 10% of difference among those who are the most happy, compare the happiest with the least happy. And something that caught my attention is that when we assessed emotional exhaustion or fatigue, there was almost 100% difference between those who suffer and don't suffer. Those people who suffer on a daily basis at work because they have tremendous level of stress. Is what happens is that we are able to convince organizations that they work on happiness related issues. What we do is that we morally contribute to improve the quality of life of people. But this is good business for the companies because this data show that at the end they are more productive. So, since this cuts that we can do among or between the happiest and the least happy, where should I set the cut point, and where can I get a statistical model that probably is not going to be debated by anyone because it has very, very specific data. What they show is that at different scopes, the variables at organization level is the happier the people are and they flourish, the more they improve all the other indicators. And something that we wanted to do, and by this I finish, we wanted to check how robust these indicators were. So we started using a different flourishing scale that was developed in 2009 by Robert and other colleagues, and what we found was exactly the same correlation from middle level to high level at this other scale for human flourishment. And here they measure different things, but they measure relations, sense of meaning of life, and optimism. And so, as a way of conclusion, when we achieve people to be happier, and organizations do that, we contribute to the people's quality of life, and to companies yield better. And that's why we need a new paradigm that sets happiness by the core, where we want to set it as the core of our societies. Thank you. Thank you, Wenceslao. Very interesting. So we are, before everybody runs out of this room, please allow me two things. One, to rescue a couple of elements we have heard. And we have been said, well-being and the correlation between happiness and quality of life, happiness, a balance between desire and happiness itself, the importance and the cultural differences in terms of emotions. How is it that governance is important to our happiness? How happiness is a democratic science, and how the government should not allow people to think they are happy, but to really promote those conditions that will yield into happiness. The impact of emotions in our lives and the importance of emotions in public policies. How important it is to promote the expression of emotions and not the promotion of happiness as such. And how it is important, or why it is important to promote happiness and reduce the feeling bad. And more than theory, it has to be a social construction of objectives and social ideals. And this correlation that is almost perfect between inequality and happiness, they have truly given us wonderful concepts. These 5 speakers that we just heard, and prior to thanking them through our applause, I want to yield the floor now to our next speaker. So he will tell us about some of the main things of his presentation.